The text arrived at 11:48 p.m. with a sun-drenched photo from Maui. My husband was smiling, his arm around the woman who helped me build my company for 6 years. Beneath the image, a single line glowed on my screen. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I stared at the photo, typed 2 words in reply, and opened an encrypted folder named Breakwater. My name is Angelina Ashford. I am 39 years old, the sole founder and managing partner of Ashford Meridian Recovery Group. My empire in Chicago is built on salvaging the unsalvageable, fixing broken supply chains for regional hospitals, untangling logistical nightmares for urban contractors across the Midwest, and restoring order when critical systems collapse. I am a professional crisis manager. Yet, the greatest crisis of my life arrived not via a frantic boardroom phone call, but in a silent, glowing notification on my personal phone at exactly 11:48 at night. I was alone in my penthouse, sitting at the long mahogany desk of my home office. The city below was a sprawling grid of amber and white lights, completely ignorant of the detonation that was about to occur hundreds of feet above the pavement. My phone vibrated against the polished wood. The screen illuminated the dark room. It was a message from my husband, Nolan Pierce. I swiped the screen open. The image loaded first. It was drenched in the sickeningly golden hour sunlight of Hawaii. Nolan was standing on the expansive, terracotta-tiled terrace of a luxury Maui resort. He was wearing a crisp linen shirt, his teeth flashing in a blinding, victorious smile. His left arm was wrapped possessively around the waist of the woman leaning into him. She wore a white silk slip dress, her head resting on his shoulder. Holding up a champagne flute, the woman was Sloan Mercer. She was not just a friend. She was my minority partner, my chief operating officer, the woman who had stood beside me for 6 years as we scaled Ashford Meridian into a massive corporate entity. Beneath the photograph was a single, venomous line of text. "Just married your business partner. You're pathetic." Most women, upon receiving a message like that, would shatter. They would drop the phone onto the desk and pace the room in disbelief. They would collapse onto the imported rug, howling into the silence. They would call their husband again and again, demanding an explanation and trying to force the truth into the open. They would pour a drink, sit down hard, and try to steady themselves. I did none of those things. I did not blink. I did not gasp. My heart rate, monitored by the smartwatch on my left wrist, barely registered an increase. I sat perfectly still, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and I studied the photograph. I did not look at them like a betrayed wife viewing the wreck of her domestic life. I looked at the image exactly the way I looked at a toxic indemnity clause buried deep within a vendor contract, a lethal liability that needed to be surgically excised before it could infect the host. I noted the angle of Nolan's chin, the specific shade of Sloane's dress, the arrogant, reckless stupidity of putting their treachery into a written, date-stamped, unalterable digital format. He thought a singular, humiliating insult would be enough to break me, to send me spiraling into a weeping, hysterical mess so they could maneuver through my emotional wreckage. Nolan was a charismatic fool. Sloane should have known better. I tapped the reply field. My fingers were steady, cold as marble. I did not ask why. I did not hurl insults. I gave them exactly what they did not expect: absolute, terrifying indifference. "Enjoy Maui." I hit send. Then, I turned my phone over, placing it face down on the desk. That was the last piece of personal communication Nolan Pierce would ever receive from me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was focused, deliberate, and final. I turned my attention to the trio of monitors dominating my workspace. I moved my mouse, bringing the screens to life. I bypassed my usual financial dashboards and project management hubs. Instead, I navigated to an isolated, encrypted drive. It required a physical biometric scan and a 24-character alphanumeric password to open. I placed my thumb on the reader. Access granted. The folder on the screen was named Breakwater. I had not built this folder tonight. I had been quietly, methodically assembling it for over 4 months. You do not build a company like mine without developing an acute, almost predatory intuition for when something is quietly rotting beneath the floorboards. I had felt the microscopic shifts in their behavior, the shared glances, the sudden alignment in board meetings, the unaccounted for hours. I had felt the rot in my marriage and the rot in my company, but I am not a woman who acts on mere suspicion. I act on indisputable data. Now, the photograph from Maui was the final, gleaming keystone that locked the entire architecture of their betrayal into place. It was time to lock everything down. I had exactly 6 hours before the sun rose over Lake Michigan and the business world woke up. My first target was the domestic infrastructure. I opened the master control panel for the penthouse. With 3 keystrokes, I revoked Nolan's biometric access to the private elevator, the front doors, and the garage. His fingerprints were now effectively erased from our home. Next, I accessed the family office portal. I logged into our primary banking suite and severed his connection to every joint account, swept the liquid assets into a holding trust under my sole name, and canceled his supplementary platinum credit cards. I watched the status bars turn from green to red. Denied, denied, denied. He was currently standing in a luxury resort in Hawaii, completely unaware that his financial lifeblood had just been severed. I then scrubbed his devices from the home network and revoked his login credentials for the company's internal calendars and non-essential servers. The domestic house was clean. Now, it was time to lock down the empire. I opened my encrypted email client and composed a new message. I added 3 recipients to the line. The first was my personal corporate litigation attorney, a man known for his merciless precision in the courtroom. The second was a senior partner at a premier forensic accounting firm. The third was Evelyn Shaw, the fiercely independent chairwoman of Ashford Meridian's board of directors. The subject line was uniform and carried the weight of a legal anvil. Immediate preservation action required. I kept the body of the email clinical, devoid of any personal sentiment. I instructed the legal team to issue immediate litigation holds on all company servers, focusing specifically on Sloan Mercer's communications, file transfers, and device backups for the past 12 months. I instructed the forensic accountant to prepare for an emergency audit of all vendor rebates and executive expense accounts. I informed Evelyn that a critical breach of fiduciary duty had occurred and an emergency board session would be necessary before the end of the week. I attached the photograph Nolan had sent, along with a brief, factual summary of my findings from the Breakwater file. I hit send. The digital envelopes flew into the ether, setting devastating machinery into motion. There was one final, crucial step. Sloan was an executive. She had authorization levels that could cause immense damage if left unchecked. I pulled up the company's master operating agreement. Buried in Section 8, Paragraph 4, was a conflict of interest clause I had insisted upon during our second round of funding. It stated that any executive under formal investigation for actions detrimental to the firm could have their unilateral approval rights temporarily suspended by the majority shareholder. That was me. I logged into the Enterprise Resource Planning System. I located Sloan Mercer's user profile. Her status was listed as active. I clicked the override button, citing the governance clause, and restricted her permissions. I froze her ability to approve outgoing payments, sign new vendor contracts, and access classified bidding documents. When she woke up in Maui and tried to check her morning briefs, she would find herself locked out of the very company she thought she was stealing. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, releasing a long, slow breath. It was nearly 2 a.m. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. Far below, the city of Chicago was a sprawling, glittering beast. Headlights moved like slow-flowing blood through the concrete arteries. The world was quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet. By the time the markets opened, the shockwaves of what I had just done would begin to register. Nolan thought he had won. He thought he had delivered a fatal blow with a cowardly text message from across the Pacific Ocean. He imagined me broken, sobbing into a pillow, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of my reality. He and Sloane were probably drinking champagne right now, toasting to their brilliant deception, entirely oblivious to the fact that the very moment they hit send on that photograph, they had handed me the evidence I needed. They had weaponized their affair, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were fighting. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. My marriage was dead. The man I had loved and the partner I had trusted were ghosts. But as I stared out at the city I had conquered, I felt no grief. I only felt the cold, hard steel of preparation. The personal tragedy was over, but the corporate war had only just begun. People look at the tailored suits, the pristine glass walls of the penthouse, and the sheer scale of Ashford Meridian Recovery Group, and they almost always make the same lazy assumption. They assume there is a trust fund buried somewhere in my lineage, or a wealthy father who handed me a golden Rolodex upon college graduation. There is not. I built this empire entirely from scratch, starting with a heavily scratched folding table in a cramped two-bedroom apartment. We do not sell consumer software or peddle marketing analytics. My firm fixes catastrophic operational failures on a massive scale. When a Tier 1 hospital network in Ohio realizes their critical surgical supply chain is 48 hours away from a total, devastating collapse during a winter surge, they do not call a standard management consultant equipped with a colorful slideshow. They call us. When a municipal transit authority in Illinois faces a complete logistical freeze threatening to paralyze the city, we are the ones who step into the breakdown and restore order before the system collapses. We employ over 400 exceptionally skilled professionals across 6 states. The actual monetary value of the firm runs well into the high 8 figures. But our true currency is not cash. Our true currency is absolute, unshakable reliability. In a corporate world governed by unpredictable chaos, my company is the ironclad guarantee that the lights will stay on and the trucks will keep moving. That reputation was not bought. It was built over a decade of discipline, sleepless nights, and a consistent record of keeping our promises under pressure. Operating at that level of intensity takes a profound psychological toll. You cannot spend 14 hours a day walking into boardrooms filled with panicked, desperate executives without carrying a heavy residue of that static electricity back home. That was the specific void Nolan Pierce filled. When I first met Nolan, I was running on pure, toxic adrenaline and caffeine. He was a revelation. He was deeply charming, wildly intelligent, and possessed this disarming, almost magical ability to make the relentless noise of the world fall completely silent. He knew exactly what to say to decompress my mind after a savage week of contract negotiations. He would take the phone out of my hand, pour a glass of heavy red wine, and force me to remember that I was a human being, not just a crisis machine. He was my quiet harbor in a perpetual storm. I genuinely believed that with him, I had finally secured a fiercely loyal, peaceful domestic life to perfectly balance the corporate battlefield I navigated every single day. He made me feel safe. Then there was Sloane. Sloane Mercer did not start at the top of the food chain. She came to me as a fiercely ambitious senior project manager, and looking at her was like looking in a mirror 10 years prior. She was sharp, ruthlessly efficient, and possessed a brilliant, almost terrifying mind for ground-level operations. I am the architect. I see the macro structure, the bold territorial plays, the aggressive regional expansions. Sloane was the master engineer. She knew exactly how to take my sweeping, overarching visions and distill them into a highly profitable, functional reality. She was so undeniably good that I eventually did the one thing founders are universally warned against doing. I let her all the way in. I did not just give her a generous salary, I handed her a 15% minority equity stake in the firm. I carved out an executive board seat specifically for her. I elevated her to the role of Chief Operating Officer, granting her the absolute right to stand shoulder to shoulder with me during our most critical, multi-million-dollar client acquisitions. She was not just my employee, she was my fully empowered right hand. Because I trusted them both so implicitly, I became the blind architect of my own impending destruction. I was the one who pulled Sloane deeply into my inner circle. I was the one who formally introduced my husband to my business partner. I invited her to our private, high-ticket charity fundraisers. I deliberately seated them next to each other at intimate, high-stakes client dinners to project a unified front. During our intense, week-long strategic retreats in Aspen or Napa Valley, the three of us would sit around the fire pit late into the night, drinking expensive bourbon and mapping out the future of the empire. I thought I was achieving the ultimate modern triumph. I thought I was seamlessly blending my chosen family with my life's work, creating an impenetrable fortress of loyalty. I was incredibly proud of the synergy we projected. I look back now and realize the grotesque, sickening irony of those nights. I was not building a unified family. I was personally escorting two intensely greedy, opportunistic predators into the exact same room, showing them the blueprints to the vault, and locking the door behind them. The shift did not happen all at once. Treachery of this magnitude rarely announces itself with a sudden explosion. At first, everything felt completely, comfortably normal. There were the usual inside jokes born from high-stress projects, the long, animated conversations about market strategy that bled into Saturday afternoons, the shared eye rolls when a difficult client made a ridiculous demand. They got along perfectly. I was thrilled that the two most important people in my life respected each other's intellect. But then, the underlying frequency of the music began to change. The shifts were so microscopic that a busy, exhausted mind could easily rationalize them away as stress or fatigue. Nolan, who used to ask me detailed, engaged questions about my day, suddenly became vague, distant, and incredibly tight-lipped about his own daily schedule. He stopped asking about the firm's growth metrics entirely. Sloan, who used to run every major operational pivot by me out of sheer respect, started unilaterally altering the times and locations of secondary strategy meetings, vaguely citing workflow efficiency. The playful inside jokes morphed into something dark and exclusionary. I would walk into the company break room or my own home kitchen, and an animated conversation would abruptly sever, replaced by a highly specific, heavy silence. It was not the panicked, guilty silence of two people caught in a fleeting, passionate romance. It was the cold, calculated silence of two people actively managing a massive liability. I was the liability. That was the true horror of my situation, the reason this betrayal possessed the power to completely kill the empire I had built. This was not a sudden, aggressive strike from a rival firm trying to steal market share. It was a deeply embedded inside job, engineered by the man who intimately knew my personal psychological vulnerabilities and the woman who literally held the operational keys to my fortress. I had not been violently knocked down in a single night. I had been slowly, methodically, and cruelly eroded by the two people I trusted most in this world. Month after agonizing month, conversation after conversation, lie after lie. The unraveling did not begin with a stray blonde hair on a lapel or a heavily perfumed receipt stuffed into a jacket pocket. Real betrayal in the corporate echelon is far too sterile for those cliches. The first true fracture appeared as a seemingly innocuous line item on a quarterly expense reconciliation report. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing the travel ledgers when I noticed two flights booked back-to-back. One was to Scottsdale, the other to Maui. They were categorized under two entirely separate emergency logistics projects, but the dates overlapped in a way that defied basic geography. A discrepancy of a few $1,000s in a multi-million-dollar budget is usually a rounding error, an administrative slip, but my instincts, honed by years of sniffing out supplier fraud, spiked. I flagged it, intending to ask Sloan about the routing during our weekly sync. Then, the secondary anomalies began to surface, stacking quietly upon one another like dead leaves. Calendar invites for routine operational reviews would abruptly vanish from my shared view, replaced by blocked-out hours labeled simply as offline strategy. The expense reports for vendor dinners began to consistently breach our internal cap, featuring wine selections that were gratuitous even by our aggressive networking standards. The most jarring anomaly came from the physical security logs. I was doing a routine audit of our downtown headquarters access data when I saw her name. Sloan had badged into the physical secure data room on the 14th floor. The timestamp read 12:45 in the morning. We were not currently engaged in any hostile takeover defense, nor were we prepping for a dawn acquisition. There was absolutely zero legitimate operational reason for the chief operating officer to be inside the airtight server room at midnight. At home, the atmosphere mirrored the silent alarms going off in the office. Nolan began implementing a new, subtle physical barrier between us. His phone, which used to sit haphazardly on the kitchen island while we cooked, was suddenly always placed face down. He began taking it with him into the master bathroom, leaving the shower running for 20 minutes while he supposedly caught up on morning news. The man who used to pour me wine and dissect the intricacies of my negotiations was gone. In his place was a hollow replica, a man whose physical body was sitting across from me at the dining table, but whose mind had entirely vacated the premises. His eyes were constantly focused on a middle distance, his responses reduced to non-committal hums. The primal reactive instinct of a wife is to demand answers. I could have thrown the expense report on the granite counter. I could have demanded to see his unlocked phone. I could have orchestrated a dramatic confrontation in the foyer. But I am an investigator by trade. I know that confronting a liar with a single, isolated piece of circumstantial evidence only does one thing. It educates them. It teaches them where your radar is sweeping so they can learn to fly beneath it. A single suspicion breeds an argument, and an argument gives them the opportunity to gaslight, to pivot, to make you feel insane. I did not need an argument. I needed an ironclad, indisputable chain of facts heavy enough to crush any possible defense. I bypassed my usual network of corporate security consultants. I needed someone entirely untraceable, someone who had zero connections to Ashford Meridian or the Chicago legal circuit. I found an independent digital forensics contractor operating out of Austin. I paid his retainer in full using a private account established long before I married Nolan. With the contractor acting as a silent guide, I turned my own home into an observation deck. Nolan and I still shared an old cloud backup for our personal devices, a relic from our first year of marriage that he had clearly forgotten to disable. I began a nightly ritual of data extraction. I cross-referenced his rideshare receipts with Sloan's corporate travel logs. I matched the IP addresses from his hotel Wi-Fi logins to the geographic locations of her supposed client meetings. They were in the same city, at the exact same time, far more frequently than coincidence or professional obligation could ever excuse. The digital footprints extended deep into the company's infrastructure. I set up silent auto-forwards on specific administrative email chains. I began tracking the metadata on our core strategic forecasting decks. I watched, sickened but fascinated, as crucial financial projections were modified, saved, and resaved at 2 or 3 in the morning. When I checked the active user logs for those specific hours, only 2 profiles were connected to the secure portal: Nolan and Sloan. They were not just sleeping together, they were working together in the dark. The devastating, undeniable proof of their endgame materialized on a rainy Thursday morning. My forensic contractor sent over a compiled dossier of newly registered commercial entities. He had run a broad sweep of state databases using variations of their names and known associates. There it was, registered in the state of Delaware, a limited liability company named Kai Crest Advisory. I pulled the publicly available incorporation documents. The registered agent was a shell service, but the attorney of record who filed the paperwork was a boutique corporate lawyer based in Manhattan. It was the exact same lawyer who had represented Sloan during her initial equity negotiation when she joined my firm, Kai Crest Advisory, a consulting firm, set up quietly, legally, and entirely outside my line of sight. I sat at my desk, the Delaware registration glowing on the monitor. My breathing was slow and measured. The profound betrayal should have brought me to my knees. It should have elicited tears or rage. Instead, it triggered a terrifying, absolute emotional detachment. They were planning to gut me, to take the intellectual property, the client relationships, and the very foundation of my life's work, and port it over to a new vessel. I created a new encrypted directory on my isolated drive. I named it Breakwater. I dragged the Delaware Limited Liability Company filing into the folder. I added the late-night access logs, the metadata trails, and the overlapping flight itineraries. As the progress bar completed the transfer, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the empty room. From this exact second forward, I was no longer Angelina, the betrayed wife. That woman no longer existed. I was the founding partner of a besieged corporation, and I was going to meticulously, ruthlessly, protect my assets. The forensic audit of the supply chain logistics did not reveal a massive, immediate hemorrhage of capital. It revealed something far more insidious, a highly sophisticated, meticulously engineered leak. My independent auditor bypassed the standard financial dashboards and dove directly into the raw transactional data from the past 8 months. They found the vendor rebate credits. In our industry, when a bulk supplier fails to meet a delivery metric, they issue a credit back to our firm. These funds were supposed to route automatically into our primary holding accounts. Instead, a series of microtransactions had been manually redirected. They were funneled through a newly verified consulting shell company, an entity intrinsically tied to the Kai Crest advisory infrastructure. The amounts were deliberately insignificant: $12,000 from a medical supplier, $18,000 from a transit vendor. It was not a heist. It was a stress test. They were running water through the pipes of their newly built financial architecture to ensure the plumbing worked flawlessly before they opened the main floodgates. Once the financial pathway was exposed, the legal mechanism designed to facilitate the theft began to surface. Deep within a nested, mislabeled directory on the shared executive drive, I uncovered a drafted amendment to our master operating agreement. The language was brilliant, weaponizing the very foundation of my intense, relentless work ethic against me. It proposed a new, highly specific succession protocol. In the event that the primary founder became incapacitated or needed to step back for severe personal health reasons, temporary executive control, along with full, unmitigated majority voting rights, would automatically transfer to the chief operating officer. The document was completely formatted, polished by outside counsel, and ready for execution. It was missing only one element to become binding law. It needed my signature. They were building a legal cage, preparing to lock me inside it the moment I showed a singular sign of weakness. Nolan was not merely a passive beneficiary riding on Sloan's corporate maneuvering. He was actively brokering the sale of my legacy. A forensic recovery of a deleted email thread from his personal server laid bare his role as the capitalization lead. He had initiated highly confidential communications with 2 distinct heavyweight private equity investors based out of New York. He was not pitching a new startup. He was shopping Ashford Meridian. He used my proprietary growth metrics, my fiercely protected client retention percentages, and the pristine brand reputation I had bled into the concrete for a decade. He pitched these investors a fabricated narrative about an impending, seamless leadership transition phase. He painted a portrait of a fatigued founder preparing to quietly exit the stage, leaving the robust operational machinery in the highly capable, dynamic hands of her partner. I had never spoken to either of these investment firms in my entire life. The absolute, breathtaking cruelty of their endgame crystallized when my team recovered a document from Sloan's cloud storage. It was a drafted memorandum intended for a boutique crisis public relations firm, outlining the exact communication strategy to be deployed immediately following their return from Maui. It was a masterclass in corporate character assassination disguised as profound professional empathy. The planned narrative was soft, sorrowful, and utterly devastating. The pitch stated that Angelina Ashford had finally succumbed to the crushing, unsustainable pressure of the crisis management industry. Her intense, deeply controlling nature had irrevocably shattered her marriage, culminating in a severe psychological unraveling. The memorandum positioned Sloan not as a usurper, but as a reluctant savior. The steady, reliable force stepping up to stabilize the organization and protect the clients amidst the founder's tragic personal collapse. I read the memorandum twice, the cold illumination washing over me in the silent penthouse. I finally understood the architecture of the photograph. The wedding in Maui was never an impulsive, romantic elopement between two people swept away by forbidden love. It was a tactical strike. It was a carefully staged theatrical production designed specifically to humiliate me, to shatter my composure, and to provoke a catastrophic, highly public meltdown. They needed me to scream. They needed me to throw things, to send unhinged emails, to become the exact hysterical, broken woman their public relations narrative required. They intended to use the chaos of my heartbreak as the smokescreen to seize total control of the company. The visual proof of this new kingdom was buried in a presentation deck. The file had its creation timestamp manually altered to look years old, but the metadata proved it was finalized just 3 weeks ago. The fourth slide featured the proposed organizational chart for their restructured, post-coup entity. Sloan Mercer sat at the top of the hierarchy, titled Chief Executive Officer. Nolan Pierce was positioned securely below her as the Strategic Communications Lead, a fabricated role designed to grant him a massive, unearned executive salary drawn directly from the revenue I had secured. The most immediate but terrifying threat was not the drafted public relations plan or the private equity pitches. It was a silent calendar invitation. Sloan had quietly scheduled a highly restricted, remote video call with a select group of our most influential board members. The meeting was set for 9 in the morning, the exact day after she and Nolan were scheduled to fly back from Hawaii. The subject line was deliberately vague but legally lethal: leadership continuity discussion. Their timeline was absolute. They intended to walk into that virtual boardroom, present the fabricated narrative of my emotional collapse, table the drafted operating agreement amendment, and formally execute my removal from power. They wanted to sever my marriage and terminate my corporate authority in the exact same hour, leaving me far too paralyzed by grief to mount any kind of coherent legal defense. I sat perfectly still in the glow of the monitors. I picked up my phone, the screen still displaying the sunlit photograph of my husband holding the woman trying to steal my life. I did not delete it. I did not throw the device. I executed a secure file transfer, moving the image directly into the encrypted Breakwater directory. I dropped the photograph right next to the forensic accounting ledgers, the private equity emails, and the drafted corporate theft documents. I watched the file icon settle into place. From that exact second forward, their grand romance was no longer a matter of the heart. It was corporate evidence. The air in the penthouse was perfectly still, chilled by the sophisticated climate control system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the deep black of the Chicago night was just beginning to bleed into the dark, bruised purple of early dawn. It was before 6 o'clock in the morning, the exact hour when the rest of the city was still wrapped in sleep, entirely oblivious to the silent, devastating warfare being waged high above the empty streets. I sat at my desk, my posture straight, my mind operating with the terrifying, frictionless clarity of a machine executing a flawless line of code. The initial lockouts I had performed during the night were immediate, tactical strikes to secure the perimeter. Now, it was time to escalate. When Nolan and I married, I was already a woman of considerable means, and I had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. He had laughed it off at the time, calling it a mere formality, an archaic piece of paper that our love would never require. He clearly had not read the fine print of paragraph 14. The document, drafted by a notoriously ruthless asset protection attorney, contained an ironclad unilateral asset freeze protocol triggered by documented breaches of marital fidelity. Operating strictly within the confines of that legally binding framework, I finalized the sequestration of our joint liquidity. I authorized my private wealth manager to immediately suspend Nolan's signatory power over our shared investment portfolios, our joint venture capital funds, and the liquid cash reserves. Any transaction requiring dual authorization was permanently blocked. If he attempted to move capital to fund his new shell company, the banking architecture would treat him like a stranger attempting a wire fraud. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the legal apparatus swung into motion. My corporate litigation attorney sent out the first wave of legal notices. A formal litigation hold was issued simultaneously to the head of the Information Technology Department, the Chief Financial Officer, and the Director of Corporate Compliance at Ashford Meridian. The language of the legal mandate was absolute and terrifying. It legally compelled the company to immediately preserve, mirror, and isolate every single piece of data connected to Sloan Mercer. Her emails, her direct messages, her deleted drafts, her server access logs, and all communications with our Tier 1 vendors were immediately impounded by the compliance software. She could not delete a single comma without triggering a federal tampering alert. 10 minutes later, the independent chairwoman of our board of directors, Evelyn Shaw, entered the battlefield. Evelyn was a veteran of brutal corporate acquisitions, a woman who possessed zero tolerance for internal espionage. I had provided her with a highly sanitized, brutally factual brief regarding Sloan's covert maneuvering, omitting the emotional wreckage of the affair and focusing entirely on the fiduciary breach. Evelyn did not hesitate. With a single, decisive keystroke, she accessed the board portal and formally canceled the rogue meeting Sloan had scheduled for the following day. Evelyn changed the subject line from a vague discussion of leadership continuity to a formal, mandatory inquiry regarding severe conflicts of interest and unauthorized strategic communications. Simultaneously, the internal systems architecture of my company was quietly restructuring itself to neutralize the threat, working alongside the terrified but entirely compliant head of digital security. I watched the dashboard as we systematically stripped Sloan of her administrative privileges. We severed her access to the master bidding repository, locking her out of the proprietary pricing algorithms that gave us our competitive edge. We revoked her clearance for the highly confidential senior human resources files, ensuring she could not poach my top-tier directors for her newly minted firm. We blocked her from viewing all unreleased client estimates and strategic forecasting models. By 6:15 in the morning, her executive profile was a hollow shell. She possessed the title of a chief operating officer, but her digital reach within the firm was now equivalent to that of a summer intern. In the wake of such a profound personal collapse, the expected human reaction is to seek the comfort of a support system. Most people would call their closest friends, weeping into the receiver. They would call their family members to narrate the betrayal, desperately seeking validation and emotional shelter. I did not make a single personal call. Instead, I pulled up the encrypted contact files for my 3 most strategic, highest revenue clients. These were the pillars of my empire, the accounts that dictated the financial gravity of the firm. In my industry, executives are accustomed to early morning crises. I dialed the first number. When the chief executive officer of the regional hospital network answered, my voice was smooth, resonant, and completely devoid of panic. I did not mention Hawaii. I did not mention my marriage. I delivered a carefully crafted, preemptive strike against the narrative Sloan intended to deploy. "Good morning," I said, my tone projecting absolute authority. "I am calling to personally inform you that there is an internal governance review currently underway at Ashford Meridian. Your delivery timelines are protected, and your operational architecture remains completely secure under my direct supervision." I repeated the exact same phrasing to the second and third clients. It was a simple, elegant sequence of words, but the underlying weight of the message was unmistakable. It signaled that I was actively hunting a problem, that I was firmly planted at the helm of the ship, and that any subsequent noise they might hear from other executives within my firm should be treated as the desperate flailing of an ousted faction. Just as I concluded the final call, my private cell phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. The sun was officially rising over Lake Michigan, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse floor. In Maui, it was deep into the night. Nolan was awake. Perhaps a late-night charge on a platinum card had been declined by the resort concierge. Perhaps the sheer, suffocating guilt of his actions had finally pierced his arrogant facade. The first text message appeared on the screen. He was attempting to pivot, trying to establish a controlled environment where he could assess the damage. "Angelina, we need to talk like adults. Please answer the phone. Things are complicated." Another message arrived seconds later. "Please do not overreact. We can figure this out. Just call me back. He was throwing out tiny, pathetic bait, desperately trying to pull me into an emotional dialogue to sniff out exactly what I knew and what I had done. He wanted me to scream at him so he could categorize me as hysterical. I did not type a single letter in response. I took a screenshot of the incoming text messages. A moment later, a frantic, 2-minute voice note appeared in the chat log. I did not even press play to listen to his voice. I simply selected the audio file, selected the screenshots, and forwarded the entire package directly to my litigation attorney. I transformed every single one of his desperate attempts at emotional manipulation into another documented layer of the legal file. By the time the high-end coffee shops and prestigious law offices of the Chicago Loop began to open their doors, the atmosphere was already shifting. The first faint whispers of a massive corporate earthquake were beginning to circulate among the elite executive assistants and junior partners. The rumor mill was awakening. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away across the Pacific Ocean, the newly married couple was likely sitting in a luxury suite, listening to the crashing waves, entirely oblivious to their new reality. They thought they were enjoying the triumphant dawn of their new empire. They did not yet know that the locks had been changed, the funds had been frozen, and their access to the world they thought they had stolen had been violently, permanently severed hours ago. The corporate headquarters of Ashford Meridian Recovery Group was a fortress of glass and steel, operating with a quiet, relentless hum. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the office floor was already alive with junior analysts, account directors, and logistics coordinators. None of them knew that the ground beneath their ergonomic chairs had fundamentally fractured during the night. I sat at my desk in the corner office, the door closed, projecting an aura of absolute business as usual. At exactly 8:15, a shadow fell across the frosted glass of my door. A soft, hesitant knock followed. The door opened to reveal Mara Tully. Mara was Sloane's executive assistant. She was 26 years old, a young woman usually defined by her immaculate posture, her razor-sharp organizational skills, and her unwavering loyalty to my chief operating officer. This morning, however, Mara looked like someone walking into a room she was terrified to enter. Her face was entirely devoid of color, and her hands gripped a thick leather tote bag so tightly her knuckles were white. "Ms. Ashford," Mara said, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "May I have a moment of your time? It is completely off the record." I did not smile. I simply gestured to one of the leather chairs positioned across from my desk. "Sit down, Mara. Shut the door behind you." She closed the door, ensuring the lock clicked into place, and sank into the chair. She did not make eye contact immediately. She stared at the polished surface of my desk, taking a long, shuddering breath. I could see the profound internal war she was fighting. She was terrified of the woman she worked for, but she was entirely paralyzed by the legal gravity of what she was about to confess. "I need to tell you what I have been doing," Mara finally said, her voice trembling but gaining a desperate traction. "And before I do, I need you to understand that for the past 6 months, I genuinely believed I was executing a highly confidential, mutually agreed upon transition plan. Sloane told me you were preparing to step back. She said you were exhausted, that you were quietly restructuring the firm, and that my tasks were part of a sensitive founder transition." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. "Tell me exactly what those tasks were." Mara opened her bag. She had me altering document timestamps on the shared executive server. Whenever she drafted a new strategic roadmap or a modified client acquisition model, she ordered me to manually backdate the creation files to make them look like legacy documents. She had me booking flights and hotel accommodations through a shadow travel agency, completely bypassing our internal procurement software. I was the one who changed the accounting codes on the incoming vendor rebates, routing them to that external consulting shell. She reached into the tote bag and pulled out a heavy silver external hard drive. She placed it carefully on the desk between us. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that dropped the room into silence. "I also sent parallel pitch decks," Mara continued, the words spilling out of her in a rush of panicked confession. Sloan would have me prepare the standard quarterly growth reports for our internal board. Then, she would hand me a completely different set of metrics, highly aggressive, modified projections, and instruct me to send them via a secure, encrypted link to a specific list of private equity contacts in New York. I looked at the hard drive, my expression completely neutral, though my mind was rapidly categorizing this new weaponry. If you believed this was a sanctioned transition, Mara, why are you sitting in my office right now? Mara finally looked up, and her eyes were bright with unshed, terrified tears. Because I saw a photograph last night. Someone from Sloan's personal network leaked a picture onto a private social media story. It was her and your husband. In Hawaii. The caption said they had just gotten married. Mara swallowed hard. Ms. Ashford. When I saw that picture, the entire narrative collapsed. I realized you were not stepping down. I realized I was not helping her manage a transition. I realized I was being used as an accessory to help her steal your company. She reached into her bag again and produced a thick manila folder. She opened it, laying the physical documents out on my desk like a dealer laying out a losing hand of cards. I brought the printed boarding manifests for every trip they took together, Mara said, tapping the first stack of papers. I brought the unsent email drafts from her outbox. I brought her handwritten notes regarding the private equity negotiations. Then, she slid a single, crisp piece of paper toward me. But this is why I came in, she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She had me draft this yesterday morning, right before she left for the airport. It is scheduled to be released to the wire services in exactly 48 hours. I picked up the paper. It was a formal press release. The header bore the official Ashford Meridian logo. The text was a masterclass in corporate deceit. It announced, with profound sadness and deep respect, that founder Angelina Ashford was taking an immediate, indefinite leave of absence to address severe personal and mental health challenges stemming from a sudden domestic crisis. It assured the market that Chief Operating Officer Sloan Mercer would assume total executive control to maintain organizational stability. There is one more thing, Mara said, leaning closer. Mr. Pierce, your husband. He has been coming into the office. I kept my eyes on the press release. When? After 8 o'clock at night, Mara replied. On the days you were traveling for site inspections. The floor would be completely empty. He would come up through the freight elevator. He and Sloan would sit in the secondary conference room for hours. They had the master client roster and the senior personnel retention list spread out on the table. They were actively circling names. They were deciding which of your directors they could successfully poach for their new firm. A lesser manager might have broken down. A woman driven by emotion might have walked around the desk, embraced the terrified assistant, and dissolved into tears of gratitude and betrayal. I did not move. I did not offer a comforting hug or a sympathetic platitude. I recognized Mara's confession for exactly what it was, a high-stakes transaction. She was trading her complicity for corporate immunity. I picked up my phone and dialed my corporate litigator. He answered on the first ring. I have a whistleblower sitting in my office, I said, my voice sharp and commanding. I need you to send a senior partner over here immediately. We are taking a formally sworn statement. We are securing physical evidence, and we are placing her under immediate legal protection. Do not let anyone from Human Resources know you are in the building. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Evelyn Shaw, the fiercely independent chairwoman of my board, sat in my office. The doors were locked. The blinds were drawn. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and a grim expression. I handed her the sworn affidavit my lawyers had just extracted from Mara, along with copies of the handwritten notes, the altered metadata logs, and the catastrophic draft of the press release. Evelyn put on her reading glasses. The room was dead silent for 10 minutes as she absorbed the sheer scale of the treachery. She read the documents with the cold, calculating eyes of a woman who had spent decades navigating the darkest corners of corporate governance. When she finally finished, she took off her glasses and placed them on the desk. She looked at me, and the air in the room felt heavy, charged with a sudden, lethal electricity. "This is not an affair scandal," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "This is not a messy divorce spilling into the hallway. This is cause for removal territory. They are actively attempting to execute a hostile, fraudulent takeover of this organization." I looked at Evelyn, a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep into my bones. The two traders currently sitting on a beach in Maui thought they were merely breaking a marriage. They thought they were leaving behind a heartbroken, pathetic wife. They had no idea that their impulsive cruelty had just handed me the exact explosive material I needed to legally obliterate them. When their return flight touched down at the international terminal, Nolan and Sloan did not come to the penthouse to face me. They did not attempt to breach the secure glass doors of the corporate headquarters to offer an explanation. They bypassed any direct confrontation and went straight to the public narrative. They chose to fight through optics first, trying to control the narrative before the legal consequences caught up with them. A digital feature dropped almost immediately in a prominent, highly circulated Chicago lifestyle magazine. The accompanying photograph was perfectly lit, heavily edited, and sickeningly staged. It showed them sitting in a sun-drenched cafe, looking thoughtfully into the distance, while their hands were tightly intertwined over a pair of coffee cups. The article was a masterclass in aggressive, preemptive victimhood. They framed themselves as two brave souls who had finally decided to choose truth over living a lie. On professional networking platforms, Sloan deployed a heavily sanitized, profoundly manipulative essay. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a toxic, fear-based corporate culture. She did not use my actual name, but the implication was a flashing neon sign directed squarely at my reputation. They worked in tandem to frame me as a cold, unfeeling machine, an ice queen of a founder who crushed everyone in her path, suffocated her own marriage, and ran her executive suite entirely on a platform of terror. They positioned themselves not as traders who stole intellectual property, but as corporate refugees who found solace in each other while trying to survive my tyrannical regime. The Chicago business elite is a small, vicious, and highly observant ecosystem. The whispers started within hours. I could feel the microscopic hesitations in the market. A few of our smaller, secondary logistics vendors suddenly stopped returning calls from our procurement desk. They were standing firmly on the sidelines, holding their breath, waiting to see which side of the empire was going to collapse before they placed their bets. They wanted to know if the queen was truly bleeding before they pledged allegiance to the usurpers. Nolan and Sloan desperately wanted me to bleed in public. They expected a furious, tearful live stream, a retaliatory magazine interview, or a messy, unhinged social media breakdown. They needed me to act like a scorned, hysterical wife to validate their carefully crafted narrative. I gave them complete silence. I did not hire a crisis public relations firm to debate my character on the internet. I did not post a single statement regarding my emotional state. While they were busy harvesting likes, shares, and sympathetic comments from strangers who had absolutely no understanding of corporate law, I was striking directly at the structural integrity of their entire future. I submitted a formal heavily documented dossier to the Commercial Procurement Ethics Board, detailing their exact intent to poach protected supply lines using stolen internal metrics. Simultaneously, my litigation team marched into civil court and filed an emergency petition for a temporary injunction. The filing was a brutal, legally binding blockade. It explicitly prohibited Nolan and Sloan from utilizing any Ashford Meridian client data, proprietary pricing algorithms, bid histories, or contact lists. If they even attempted to email one of my clients using the information they had stolen, they would be in direct contempt of a federal court order. While the lawyers secured the external perimeter, I needed to secure the interior of the house. I called a mandatory and company-wide meeting in the main atrium of our headquarters. Over 400 employees gathered in the expansive space. The air was thick with tension. Analysts, directors, and administrative staff stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces tight with anxiety, having read the morning gossip columns and the slick magazine profile. They were terrified that the company was about to fracture into a million pieces. I stepped up to the microphone. I wore a tailored, dark navy suit. My posture was flawless. I did not look like a woman whose husband had just publicly humiliated her in front of the entire city. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer who had built a massive enterprise from nothing. I spoke for exactly 3 minutes. "Good morning," I said, my voice projecting calm, resonant authority across the massive room. "You have all seen the news. I am not here to discuss the intricacies of my personal life, nor will I stand here and disparage former members of this executive team. I am here to confirm that a severe internal governance violation has occurred. The board of directors, alongside external legal counsel, has taken immediate, decisive action." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd, making direct contact with the key directors. "What you need to know today is this. Your payroll is completely secure. Your health benefits are untouched. Every single client contract remains fully operational and protected. We are the premier crisis management firm in the entire Midwest. We fix disasters for a living. Today, we simply manage our own. The ship is steady. Now, please get back to work." There was a brief, stunned silence, and then a palpable, collective exhale rippled through the massive crowd. The tension drained from the room instantly. They did not need a weeping victim seeking their pity. They needed a captain who was firmly gripping the wheel. By refusing to play the chaotic role Sloan had written for me, I anchored the entire organization. The employees saw exactly who was holding the steel beams in place while the other two threw stones from the outside. The absolute, undeniable confirmation of my strategy arrived later that afternoon, sitting quietly in my secure inbox. It came directly from the chief financial officer of our largest healthcare client, a man who personally controlled a contract worth roughly $30 million annually. The subject line of the email was completely blank. The body of the message contained a single, chilling sentence. "Thought you should see this before the public narrative gets completely out of hand." Attached to the message was a forwarded email thread from exactly 5 months ago. The original sender was Nolan. He had reached out to this critical client under the guise of a casual private lunch invitation to discuss market trends. The second paragraph of the forwarded email was the ultimate smoking gun. Nolan had written, "I am currently finalizing a significant personal restructuring, and I look forward to introducing you to a far more agile, dynamic consulting platform in the coming months once the dust settles." I sat at my desk, reading the words "personal restructuring" over and over again. It was a sterile, soulless corporate euphemism for divorcing his wife, shattering her life, and stealing her assets. This email proved beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that Nolan was not a man swept away by a sudden, uncontrollable wave of romantic passion. He had premeditated the commercialization of his betrayal. He had viewed our marriage not as a partnership, but as a depreciating asset, and he had planned to leverage its violent destruction to launch his new enterprise. Across the city, Sloan was likely sitting in a leased luxury apartment, obsessively refreshing her social media feeds to measure the success of her public relations campaign. She genuinely thought she was winning because people were talking about her, but public opinion does not sign massive payroll checks. A sympathetic magazine article does not override a commercial injunction. As the heavy legal notices began to land in her inbox that afternoon, carrying the devastating weight of state and federal law, the intoxicating rush of the media spotlight would begin to violently fade. She was about to realize that while she had been busy fighting for the public narrative, the actual structural ground beneath her feet had already cracked wide open. The conference room at my legal counsel's office was soundproof, sterile, and heavily air-conditioned. We were deep into the aggressive preparation phase for the upcoming depositions. My lead litigator, a man who possessed absolutely zero capacity for empathy, slid a thick, heavily tabbed black binder across the polished mahogany table. It did not contain corporate strategy or vendor disputes. It contained the absolute, unvarnished truth of my husband's personal financial existence. When you strip away the custom-tailored Italian suits, the expensive watches, and the charismatic, effortless smile, the raw numerical data always tells the real story. Nolan was drowning. He was not just casually in debt. He was heavily, dangerously submerged in crippling margin debt across 2 private brokerage accounts. Beyond the disastrous equity trading losses, the financial investigator had unearthed a massive, defaulted commercial loan. It was tied to a highly ambitious, failed boutique hospitality project from 3 years ago, a project he had explicitly told me he exited cleanly and profitably before we were even married. Worse, the binder contained the details of 2 highly confidential, severely expensive settlement agreements stemming from collapsed brand partnerships he had mismanaged in his independent consulting work. The revelation hit me not with a wave of crushing sorrow, but with the brutal, blinding clarity of a perfectly solved equation. Nolan did not simply fall out of love with me over time. He did not get swept away by the intoxicating, forbidden allure of my chief operating officer. He was a desperate man backed into an incredibly tight financial corner, staring down the barrel of imminent, highly public bankruptcy. He looked at Sloane, saw her direct operational access to my highly lucrative corporate contracts, and identified his ultimate, multi-million-dollar life raft. I was never a beloved wife being tragically replaced by a younger, sharper woman. I was a highly solvent, heavily insured asset being targeted for liquidation to cover his hidden, humiliating liabilities. The true, terrifying scale of their intended commercial extraction became undeniably clear when the forensic accountants delivered their final, comprehensive report on the diverted vendor rebates. What we initially suspected was a minor, tentative structural test of their newly built shell company was actually a massive, systematic siphoning operation. They were not just testing the plumbing of Kai Crest Advisory. They had successfully diverted enough capital to fully fund the operational runway for their new firm for its first 6 months of existence. They were literally using my own hard-earned revenue to finance the exact corporate weapon they planned to use to destroy me. Sloane's legal team, clearly panicked by the devastating weight of the temporary commercial injunction my lawyers had secured, attempted to deploy a desperate, sloppy defense. They filed a rapid motion claiming those redirected funds were part of a previously agreed-upon verbal strategic bonus structure meant to reward her operational efficiency. It was an insulting amateur maneuver designed for a much weaker opponent. Thanks to the physical hard drive Mara Tully had placed on my desk, my attorneys completely eviscerated their argument before the judge even had time to fully read it. The deeply embedded metadata logs proved beyond any shadow of a legal doubt that the authorizing documents Sloane's team presented had been digitally fabricated, heavily altered, and backdated several weeks after the funds were actually moved. The electronic footprint of her financial fraud was completely undeniable. However, the most chilling, deeply disturbing discovery of the week did not revolve around stolen vendor money, fabricated public relations drafts, or poached client rosters. It came directly from the independent digital security team I had hired to sweep the entire internal server network for latent vulnerabilities. They found a specific, highly alarming access log buried deep in the system registry. 4 months ago, deep in the middle of the night, Sloane had utilized her highest-level executive override privileges to bypass the standard security protocols and access a deeply buried, highly restricted directory on the private server. It was not a corporate file. It was my personal estate planning folder. She had opened the highly sensitive documents detailing my private trusts, the precise valuation of my distinct personal real estate holdings, and the exact beneficiary structures of my life insurance policies. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of that violation made the air in my lungs turn to solid ice. She did not just want to steal the corporate empire I had built with my own hands. She wanted to look deep into my private vault to see exactly how much wealth I possessed outside the firm. She was hunting for every single personal vulnerability, sizing up my entire financial existence to calculate exactly how much of my life they could burn to the ground. The crushing psychological weight of this impending legal and financial annihilation finally broke Nolan's carefully maintained facade late on a Thursday night. It was nearly midnight. I was sitting alone at my kitchen island, quietly reviewing the deposition strategy under the soft glow of the pendant lights, when my personal cell phone rang. The screen displayed an entirely unknown number. I let it ring 3 times before I finally answered. keeping the phone completely silent against my ear. Angelina. It was Nolan. But the smooth, arrogant resonance of his voice, the voice that had charmed investors and whispered lies to me for years, was completely gone. He sounded breathless, ragged, and genuinely, profoundly terrified. The harsh reality of the frozen domestic assets, the brutal commercial injunctions, and the undeniable forensic evidence had finally pierced his grand delusions of a clean getaway. "Please do not hang up on me," he said, the words spilling out in a panicked, pathetic rush. "I had to use a prepaid phone. My lawyers are blocking everything. Angelina, this has gone way too far. The aggressive lawsuits, the public relations mess, the asset freezes. It is destroying absolutely everything. We need to sit down, just the two of us, quietly in a room. We can figure this out without burning both of our lives to the ground. Please." I did not yell at him. I did not hurl the long, pathetic list of his hidden debts in his face. I did not demand to know why he allowed his mistress to read my private life insurance policies. I simply sat there in the quiet penthouse and let the heavy silence stretch over the cellular connection. I forced him to sit in the suffocating, unbearable agony of his own total exposure. I wanted him to hear his own raw desperation echoing back at him in the dark. "Are you still there?" he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly, completely devoid of its usual power. "I am here," I replied, my tone flat, cold, and entirely devoid of human mercy. "You made your choices on that balcony in Maui. Nolan, any further communication regarding those choices will be directed entirely through my legal counsel." I ended the call immediately. I did not bother blocking the number. I simply turned the device over and pushed it away. I walked into my home office, the city lights reflecting brightly off the dark wood of my desk. I woke up the monitors, bypassed the biometric security protocols, and opened the encrypted Breakwater folder. I created a new, blank text document, positioning it right next to the forensic accounting reports, the margin debt ledgers, and the fabricated press release. I typed a single, decisive observation into the file. He is no longer negotiating from arrogance. He is negotiating from exposure. I saved the document, closed the folder, and shut down the monitors. The heavy, suffocating feeling of betrayal that had gripped my chest since that first cruel text message arrived had completely evaporated. The entire balance of power had violently, irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the blindsided wife terrified of being left behind in the ruins of my life. I was the architect of their impending ruin. Out there in the dark city, Nolan and Sloan were finally realizing that the solid foundation they thought they had built their new life upon was actually a trapdoor. And I was the only one holding the lever. The calendar for the upcoming week was not merely a schedule, it was a tightly packed legal gauntlet. My legal team had engineered a compressed, inescapable gauntlet. Over the span of 4 consecutive days, we were set to execute a temporary evidentiary hearing regarding the division of marital assets, convene a highly restricted special session of the board of directors to formally terminate my chief operating officer, and finally, present our arguments for a permanent commercial injunction in federal court. The events were stacked back to back, strictly designed to suffocate the opposition by denying them a single moment to breathe, pivot, or regroup. Across the city, the opposing counsel was operating under a fatal, profound miscalculation. They still believed they were dealing with a deeply wounded spouse who prized her public dignity above all else. Their entire strategy relied on the arrogant assumption that the sheer psychological terror of a prolonged, highly publicized corporate bloodbath would eventually force my hand. They expected me to offer a lucrative, quiet settlement behind closed doors just to make the nightmare disappear. They wanted a golden parachute woven from my exhaustion. They were going to get a hard legal answer instead. The centerpiece of this fateful week was the emergency board meeting. We gathered in the main executive conference room on the top floor of our headquarters. The air was thin, cold, and heavily charged with impending violence. I sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by my corporate litigator and Evelyn Shaw. Opposite me sat my soon-to-be former partner, accompanied by her own aggressive, heavily compensated legal advisors. Nolan was not permitted in the building, legally banished to whatever leased residential space they were currently occupying in the city. Sloane looked pale but possessed a brittle, manufactured confidence. She was ready to deploy what she genuinely believed was her ultimate trump card. Midway through the proceedings, just as Evelyn began to outline the formal, undeniable grounds for termination, Sloane's lead attorney slid a single, heavily stapled packet across the polished wood of the table. "Before we proceed with any votes regarding termination," her attorney stated, his voice laced with rehearsed, condescending authority, "we must formally enter this proxy designation into the corporate record. It was legally drafted and notarized exactly 8 months ago. I did not touch the document. I let my own counsel review it without breaking eye contact with the woman sitting across from me. It was a continuity of Operations Proxy. The language stated that in the highly specific event I became incapacitated due to a severe personal crisis, my majority voting rights would be temporarily parked in an emergency executive committee. It was a committee mathematically structured to give Sloane the absolute controlling vote. They were laying the document down like a guillotine blade, looking directly at me, waiting for the exact moment my composure would finally shatter in front of the board of directors. They wanted me to yell, to snatch the paper, to prove I was exactly the unhinged, unstable founder their media narrative required. I merely leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked at Evelyn. Evelyn did not even bother reaching for her reading glasses. She opened a slender manila folder resting at her elbow with the calm precision of someone who already knew how this would end. "Are you referring to the proxy drafted prior to our Series B recapitalization exactly 2 years ago?" she asked, her voice as dry and hard as desert rock. Sloane's attorney frowned, the first microscopic crack appearing in his aggressive confidence. "The proxy is legally binding and entirely supersedes standard operational. The proxy is completely void," Evelyn interrupted, her tone absolute and freezing. She withdrew a heavy, formally bound trust document and slid it to the exact center of the table. "During the recapitalization process 24 months ago, all of the founders' voting units were permanently transferred into a highly specialized asset protection trust. That trust contains a springing veto clause. I highly suggest you turn your attention to paragraph 9. The opposing counsel scrambled to read the highlighted text, their hands suddenly lacking their previous smoothness. Evelyn did not wait for them to finish reading the complex legal jargon. She recited the clause from memory. "In the event of any documented, concealed related party conduct, or any coordinated effort to engage in unfair commercial competition against this firm, any and all previously drafted proxy transfers are immediately and permanently nullified. The absolute veto power springs directly back to the primary shareholder." Evelyn paused, letting the heavy silence crush the air out of the room. "The forensic digital evidence regarding the newly formed Delaware entity and the diverted vendor capital triggers this clause automatically. Your document is completely worthless," before they could even attempt to recover from the blunt legal blow. My litigator delivered the secondary, lethal strike. He produced a sworn, notarized affidavit from the managing director of our primary commercial bank. The affidavit explicitly confirmed that not a single cent of our operating capital, nor any extension of our massive corporate credit lines, would be permitted to flow toward their new advisory shell company without my direct, physical signature on the authorization forms. The financial pipeline they had spent months secretly building was now effectively sealed. Sloane stared at the documents scattered on the table. The brittle confidence completely vanished, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that she had walked into a meticulously designed trap. She had tried to play corporate chess with a woman who owned the board, the pieces, and the bank that funded the game. By the time the board meeting adjourned and the termination for cause was officially formalized, the atmosphere outside the towering glass building had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer merely containing a private domestic dispute. When I descended to the ground floor lobby, the heavy revolving doors were flanked by journalists from premier commercial finance publications. They were not gossip columnists looking for a story about a broken marriage or a jilted lover. They were seasoned investigative business reporters who smelled blood in the water. They knew a massive governance explosion was detonating inside a $90 million logistics empire, and the scent of corporate treason was far more lucrative than any marital affair. Somewhere across the city, sitting in an apartment and reading the real-time, disastrous updates from his terrified partner, Nolan finally understood the catastrophic, irreversible error of his timeline. For months, he believed that sending that arrogant, sun-drenched photograph from the islands was his final triumphant blow. He thought it was the end of the game, the precise moment he won his freedom and secured his fortune. Now, buried under an avalanche of injunctions and forensic financial audits, he realized the devastating truth. The photograph was not a killing strike, it was a permanent, digital timestamp. It was the exact anchor point I needed to take months of disparate, circumstantial suspicions and lock them into a legally binding chain of premeditated corporate theft. He had voluntarily provided the prosecution with the exact moment his covert betrayal became a public, actionable liability. He had built the gallows, and then he had gleefully sent me the receipt. The morning of the final commercial injunction hearing arrived with a cold, overcast sky. The air in the city felt heavy, gray, and completely still. I stood in my dressing room, entirely alone, and pulled on a dark, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. I did not wear bright colors to draw the eye. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry aside from a heavy steel watch on my left wrist. I looked into the full-length mirror and saw exactly what I needed to see. A general walking out onto the battlefield solely to accept an unconditional surrender. I took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage. My driver was waiting with the engine running. As I climbed into the spacious back seat of the town car, I did not bring a heavy, overflowing briefcase stuffed with frantic, last-minute legal defenses. I did not carry a phone buzzing with desperate, pleading text messages. I carried only a single, incredibly thin leather binder. It was remarkably light in my hands. I did not need anything else, because every single piece of ammunition required to permanently bury my opponents was already officially entered into the public record. All that remained was to stand upright in the federal courtroom and watch the cold earth close over them. The special board meeting convened precisely at 9 a.m. Sloan Mercer sat across from me at the long oak table, her posture a masterclass in manufactured serenity. She wore a pristine tailored blazer, projecting the polished image of a highly capable executive forced to endure a hysterical founder's emotional witch hunt. That carefully constructed illusion lasted exactly 14 minutes. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted the moment my general counsel took the floor. He did not raise his voice. He simply projected the digital forensic report onto the massive display screen. We walked the silent board members through the late-night access logs, the metadata timestamps proving the deliberate fabrication of strategic documents, and the precise routing pathways of the diverted vendor rebates. When the drafted public relations release, the exact document detailing my supposed mental breakdown and her heroic ascension to power, flashed onto the screen, Sloane's serene mask finally began to fracture. Then, Mara Tully entered the room. Mara did not look at her former boss. She looked directly at Evelyn Shaw and the independent directors. She detailed, under oath, the explicit orders she received to manually alter document timestamps, to coordinate secret calendar invites, and to prepare two entirely different sets of financial projections for the exact same negotiations. Her testimony was a devastating surgical strike that completely obliterated Sloane's desperate attempt to frame the situation as a simple personal misunderstanding. The forensic accountant delivered the final blow. He drew a brutal, undeniable straight line connecting the stolen money, the encrypted emails, the overlapping travel schedules, and the Delaware Shell Company. It was a comprehensive, undeniable map of corporate treason. Nolan and Sloane had weaponized their intimate proximity to me to systematically prepare for the theft of our clients, our leadership structure, and the entire financial future of the company. Evelyn Shaw called for the vote. It was instantaneous and unanimous. The board formally removed Sloane from her executive position and stripped her of her board seat for cause. But the true devastation for her arrived with the financial consequences. Because she was terminated for a malicious breach of fiduciary duty, The punitive buyback clause buried deep within our operating agreement was instantly activated. She had spent 6 years dreaming of cashing out her 15% equity stake for tens of millions of dollars. Instead, the firm was legally authorized to repurchase her shares at a staggering punitive discount. She was walking away with a fraction of pennies on the dollar. Her entire corporate net worth was vaporized in a matter of seconds. We moved seamlessly from the boardroom to the federal courthouse for the commercial injunction hearing. The commercial judge, having reviewed the mountain of digital and financial evidence, did not offer them a single inch of leniency. The gavel fell with absolute finality. He issued a permanent, binding order barring Nolan and Sloan from utilizing any portion of our client roster, our bidding algorithms, our strategic forecasting decks, or our vendor contacts. Furthermore, they were legally gagged from ever claiming any past or present affiliation with Ashford Meridian Recovery Group in their new venture. On the domestic front, the family court executed my prenuptial agreement with lethal efficiency. Nolan's desperate legal maneuvers to penetrate the company's valuation, lay claim to the penthouse, or access my standalone investment portfolios were completely dismissed by the judge. The court applied the framework entirely in my favor, protecting my assets and mandating that his legal team surrender all electronic devices and any duplicated company data in his possession within 48 hours. The grand financial extraction he had meticulously planned was officially dead. The true climax of the entire ordeal did not happen in front of a judge or a board of directors. It happened in the polished marble hallway outside the family court chambers. I was walking toward the elevators, flanked by my legal team, when Nolan stepped directly into my path. The charismatic, effortlessly elegant man I had married was completely gone. His suit looked slightly rumpled, his shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant, victorious light in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, ragged exhaustion. He looked at me, his expression a pathetic mixture of total defeat and lingering disbelief that his perfect, foolproof plan had been so thoroughly crushed. "Angelina," he said, his voice dropping, carrying a raw, desperate vulnerability. "Did it really have to go this far?" I stopped walking. I did not yell. I did not feel the sudden, fiery rush of vindication I thought I might. I just looked at him, feeling nothing but a profound, icy clarity. I held his gaze for a long time, letting the absolute finality of his ruin settle heavily over him. "No, Nolan," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of warmth. "We did not go this far. You and she planned to go this far a long time ago. I simply finished the trip." I did not wait for him to process the words. I stepped around him and kept walking. I left him standing completely alone in the center of the crowded hallway, stripped of his marriage, his stolen company, and his entire future, with absolutely nothing left to say. 7 months later, the air in Chicago is crisp and clear. I am sitting at the head of a massive custom-built conference table in our newly expanded downtown headquarters. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city is a blur of motion and endless ambition. I am holding a heavy silver pen, preparing to sign the largest logistics partnership agreement in the history of Ashford Meridian Recovery Group. I am not signing this document as a woman who successfully executed a bitter revenge. I am signing it as a founder who survived a highly calculated attempt to take her life's work. Sometimes, my mind briefly drifts back to that sun-drenched photograph and that cruel, flippant text message. Nolan thought his words, "You are pathetic," would serve as my breaking point. He did not realize that he was merely providing the exact, legally binding timestamp marking the exact second their freefall began. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with the community. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.